Back in the fall of 1989, I was living in a small apartment complex just outside of Portland, Oregon. I was a college student at the time, juggling classes and a part-time job, so my evenings were often spent unwinding on the balcony of my third-floor apartment. It was late October and the nights were getting cooler. One evening, around 11 p.m., I stepped out onto the balcony with a cup of tea, hoping to relax for a bit before heading to bed. The moon was nearly full, casting a pale light over the trees and the parking lot below. The air was crisp, and the usual nighttime sounds, the rustling of leaves, distant traffic, were all I could hear. As I sipped my tea, I noticed a strange movement in the tree line at the edge of the forest. At first, I thought it was a deer or maybe a stray dog, but as I focused my attention, I realized it was something much larger. My heart started to race as I watched the figure emerge from the shadows. It was a creature unlike anything I had ever seen. Standing on two legs, it was covered in dark, shaggy fur and easily stood over 7 feet tall. It had a wolf-like face with pointed ears and glowing amber eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. Its muscular arms ended in clawed hands, and as it moved, it did so with a terrifying, predatory grace. The creature slowly walked towards the edge of the parking lot, its eyes scanning the area. I was frozen in place, unable to tear my gaze away. It was then that the creature seemed to sense my presence. It turned its head and looked directly at me, those glowing eyes locking onto mine. A chill ran down my spine, and I could feel my entire body tense up. For what felt like an eternity, we stared at each other. I could see its breath misting in the cool night air, hear the faint growl rumbling from its throat. Then, without warning, it let out a low, menacing growl and took a step towards the building. Panic surged through me, and I backed away from the railing, retreating into the safety of my apartment. I quickly locked the balcony door and closed the curtains, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't believe what I had just seen. My rational mind tried to make sense of it. Was it a person in a costume? Some kind of escaped animal? But deep down, I knew it was something far more sinister. I spent the rest of the night huddled on the couch, too afraid to sleep. Every creak of the building, every rustle of the wind outside made me jump. I kept the lights on and the phone close by, ready to call for help if I needed to. But as the hours passed, the night remained eerily quiet. The next morning, I cautiously ventured out onto the balcony. The forest looked the same as it always did, peaceful and unassuming. There was no sign of the creature, no tracks or evidence that it had ever been there. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had encountered something otherworldly, something that defied explanation. Over the years, I've told a few close friends about that night, but most of them just laugh it off or suggest I was dreaming. But I know what I saw was real. It wasn't a figment of my imagination or a trick of the light. It was a Dogman, a creature I've since read about on sites like Phantoms and Monsters. Even now, decades later, the memory of those glowing eyes and that low growl haunt me. I never saw the creature again, but every time I step out onto a balcony or walk past a darkened forest, I can't help but look over my shoulder, half expecting to see it watching me from the shadows. This happened back in the summer of 2002, and to this day, it still creeps me out. I'm not usually into the whole supernatural thing, but this experience made me question everything. So I was out hiking in the Nicollet National Forest in Wisconsin. I love the peace and quiet of the forest, and it's my go-to place to unwind. after a stressful week. On this particular evening, I lost track of time and ended up staying out later than usual. By the time I realized, the sun was already setting and I had to hurry back to my car. As twilight descended, the forest became eerily silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, just dead quiet. That's when I started to feel like something was watching me. At first, I tried to brush it off, thinking it was just my mind playing tricks. But then I heard a low growl coming from the bushes on my right. My heart skipped a beat. I stopped and peered into the underbrush, trying to see what was making the noise. And that's when I saw it, a huge dark figure standing on two legs. It had the body of a man, but was covered in thick dark fur. Its head was distinctly wolf-like, with glowing amber eyes that seemed to pierce through the gloom. I was frozen in place, absolutely terrified. The creature just stood there staring at me. It took a step forward, and I could see its claws glinting in the dim light. My first instinct was to run, but I knew I wouldn't get far. Instead, I slowly started to back away, trying not to provoke it. The creature watched me the whole time, its growl getting louder. Just as I thought it might pounce, it tilted its head as if curious. Then, without any warning, it turned and disappeared back into the forest. I didn't waste any time. I ran all the way back to my car, not daring to look back. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely get the keys into the ignition. When I got home, I couldn't bring myself to tell anyone. I mean, who would believe me? But I started looking up similar encounters online and found stories about dogmen and werewolves that matched what I saw. It was both reassuring and disturbing to know that others had experienced the same thing. Since then, I'm way more cautious when I hike, always making sure to be back before dark and never going alone. The forest still calls to me, but it's different now. It feels like there's something lurking out there. Something we don't understand. In the late summer of 2021, I had an experience that still sends shivers down my spine whenever I think about it. I live in a small town along the Ohio River in Kentucky, and one evening I decided to take a walk along the riverbank to clear my head. It was around 7 p.m. and the sun was just starting to set, casting a warm golden glow over the water. The path along the river was quiet, with only the sounds of the water gently lapping against the shore and the occasional bird call breaking the silence. I was about a mile from home, walking along a secluded stretch of the path that was bordered by dense woods on one side and the river on the other. I always loved this part of the trail because it felt like I was completely surrounded by nature. As I walked, I started to get the eerie feeling that I was being watched. I stopped and looked around, but I didn't see anything unusual. Shaking off the feeling, I continued on, but the sense of being watched only grew stronger. I picked up my pace, hoping to get back to a more populated area of the trail. That's when I heard it, a low growl coming from the woods to my left. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The growl was deep and guttural, unlike anything I had ever heard before. I slowly turned towards the sound, and that's when I saw it. Standing just inside the tree line, partially obscured by the shadows, was a massive, wolf-like creature on two legs. The creature was covered in dark, matted fur and had piercing yellow eyes that seemed to glow in the fading light. It stood at least 7 feet tall, with broad shoulders and long, muscular arms that ended in clawed hands. It was watching me intently, its eyes locked onto mine. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or even scream. The creature took a step forward, its growl growing louder. I could see its sharp teeth glinting in the dim light, and my mind raced with thoughts of what it might do next. I knew I had to get away, but I didn't want to provoke it by making any sudden movements. Summoning all my courage, I slowly started to back away, keeping my eyes on the creature. It followed my movements, matching my pace, its eyes never leaving me. I was terrified that if I turned my back on it, it would attack. As I continued to back away, I stumbled over a tree root and nearly fell, catching myself just in time. The creature let out a snarl and took another step towards me. I knew I couldn't keep backing away forever. I had to make a run for it. Taking a deep breath, I turned and sprinted down the trail as fast as I could. I could hear the creature crashing through the underbrush behind me, its growls echoing in the still evening air. I ran for what felt like miles, my lungs burning and my legs aching, until I finally reached a more populated section of the trail. There were a few people out for an evening walk, and I sprinted towards them, shouting for help. When I looked back, the creature was gone. It had disappeared back into the woods as quickly as it had appeared. I told the people on the trail what I had seen, but they looked at me like I was crazy. They didn't hear or see anything unusual. I didn't care. I was just relieved to be safe. I made my way home as quickly as I could, constantly looking over my shoulder, half expecting the creature to reappear. But I know what I saw, and I'll never forget it. To this day, I avoid that stretch of the trail, especially in the evening. Whatever it was real, and it was watching me from the woods by the river. I've been debating whether or not to share this story, but I need to get it off my chest. This happened last fall, and I still can't wrap my head around it. For some context, I live in a small town just outside of Portland, Oregon, and I love spending time in the woods. But after this, I'm not so sure anymore. It was late September, and I decided to take a walk in the forest near my apartment complex. I've always found it peaceful out there, and it's a great way to clear my mind. That evening, I ventured out a bit further than usual, enjoying the cool, crisp air and the sounds of nature. The sun was setting, and I figured I had enough time to make it back before dark. As I was walking back, I started feeling uneasy, like I was being watched. The woods were unusually quiet, which should have been my first clue that something was off. I quickened my pace, but the feeling only intensified. Then I heard it. A low, guttural growl that made my blood run cold. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. The growl came again, this time closer. I looked around, trying to see what was making the noise, and that's when I saw it. Standing partially obscured by the trees was a massive figure, easily over 7 feet tall. It was covered in dark fur and had a head that looked like a wolf's, with glowing yellow eyes that seemed to lock onto mine. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. This thing was standing on 2 legs, with long, muscular arms hanging at its sides. It stared at me, and I felt a wave of fear like I've never experienced before. I knew I had to get out of there, but I was too scared to move. The creature took a step forward, and that snapped me out of my trance. I turned and ran as fast as I could, not daring to look back. I could hear it moving behind me, crashing through the underbrush. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the woods and saw the lights of my apartment complex. Only then did I risk a glance over my shoulder, but the creature was gone. When I got home, I was shaking so badly I could barely unlock the door. I spent the rest of the night checking the windows and jumping at every little sound. I didn't sleep at all. The next day, I told a few friends what happened, but they just laughed it off, saying it was probably a bear or my imagination running wild. But I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear or a trick of the light. It was real, and it was terrifying. Since then, I've done some research and found stories about dogmen and werewolves that match what I saw. And it's comforting to know I'm not alone, but it also makes me uneasy knowing these things might be out there. I've been back to the woods since, but I'm always on edge, especially when it starts getting dark. Thanks for listening. If anyone has had a similar experience or knows more about these creatures, I'd love to hear from you. Stay safe out there. It was the summer of 1995, and I was living in a rural area just outside of Asheville, North Carolina. My family had a small farmhouse that was surrounded by acres of thick forest. We were used to the sounds of nature and the occasional visits from wildlife, but what I experienced that summer was something I could never have imagined. One warm evening in late July, I was home alone. My parents had gone into town for the night, and my younger brother was staying over at a friend's house. I was enjoying the peace and quiet, watching TV in the living room with our dog, Jake, lying at my feet. It was around 10 p.m. when Jake suddenly perked up and started growling at the window. His fur was standing on end, and he was acting more aggressively than I had ever seen. I muted the TV and listened, trying to figure out what had spooked him. At first, all I could hear was the usual nighttime chorus of crickets and frogs, but then I heard something else, a low, rumbling growl near the tree line. My heart started to race as I stood up and walked over to the window, peering out into the darkness. At first, I thought it might be a bear. The creature was massive, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, with a muscular, upright body covered in thick, dark fur. It had a long snout and pointed ears like a wolf, and its eyes glowed a sinister yellow in the dim light. The creature moved with an unnatural, almost predatory grace as it approached the edge of the yard. I could see its powerful limbs and the way its claws glinted in the moonlight. It let out another low growl, and Jake went into a frenzy, barking and snarling at the window. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or make a sound. The creature stopped at the edge of the yard, just beyond the reach of the porch light, and looked directly at me. Its eyes seemed to bore into my soul, and I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me. I knew I had to do something, but I was too scared to move. After what felt like an eternity, the creature turned and slowly retreated back into the woods, disappearing into the shadows. I stood there trembling until I could no longer hear its footsteps or growls. Only then did I manage to pull myself away from the window and lock all the doors and windows in the house. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, sitting on the couch with a baseball bat in one hand and Jake by my side. Every little noise made me jump, and I kept imagining those glowing yellow eyes watching me from the darkness. When my parents came home the next morning, I told them what had happened. They were skeptical, thinking I had just seen a large dog, or maybe even imagined the whole thing, but I knew what I had seen was real. In the following weeks, I avoided going outside after dark and always made sure the house was securely locked up at night. I never saw the creature again, but the memory of that night stayed with me. I started researching similar encounters and came across stories of dogmen and werewolves. It was a relief to know I wasn't the only one who had seen something like this, but it also made me realize just how real and dangerous these creatures could be. Even now, all these years later, I can't forget the terror I felt that night. Whenever I hear about Dogman sightings, it brings back the memory of those glowing yellow eyes and that deep, menacing growl. I hope I never encounter such a creature again, but I know that they are out there lurking in the shadows, waiting for their next victim. It was the spring of 1993, and I had just moved to a small town in northern Michigan for a new job. The town was quaint, nestled between sprawling forests and serene lakes. I rented a modest apartment on the second floor of an old house with a balcony that offered a stunning view of the nearby woods. Little did I know those woods held a secret that would forever change my perception of reality. One night in early April, I decided to spend the evening on the balcony. The weather was just warm enough to sit outside comfortably, and the sounds of the forest were soothing after a long day at work. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting. I brushed off the feeling and continued reading. The sky grew darker, and the moon began to rise, illuminating the forest with an eerie silver light. It was around 10 p.m. when I heard it, a distant, mournful howl that sent shivers down my spine. I paused, straining to listen, but the howl did not come again. I told myself it was just a coyote or perhaps a wolf, though I had never heard one sound quite like that. I returned to my book, but my concentration was broken. The forest felt different now, almost sinister. I glanced up frequently, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. Then I saw it. A large, dark figure moving slowly through the underbrush, its silhouette barely discernible in the moonlight. At first, I thought it might be a bear, but as it stepped into a patch of moonlight, my breath caught in my throat. The creature was enormous, standing on two legs like a man, but covered in thick, matted fur. Its head was distinctly wolf-like, with pointed ears and a long snout. It moved with a fluid, almost graceful gait, its glowing eyes scanning the surroundings. I was frozen, unable to tear my eyes away from this nightmarish apparition. The creature stopped at the edge of the forest, just a few yards from the house. It sniffed the air, and I swear it turned its head and looked directly at me. Our eyes locked, and I felt a wave of primal fear wash over me. I knew this was not a bear or any other known animal. This was something else, something far more terrifying. As I watched, the creature began to sniff the ground, its massive claws raking through the fallen leaves. It moved closer to the house, its growls vibrating through the night air. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could hardly breathe. The thought of going inside crossed my mind, but I was too afraid to move, fearing it would draw the creature's attention. Minutes felt like hours as I stood there, watching in horrified fascination. Then, without warning, the creature threw its head back and let out a bone-chilling howl. The creature then turned and loped back into the woods, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as it had appeared. I stood there for a long time, trying to process what I had just witnessed. Eventually, I stumbled back inside, locking the door behind me. I didn't sleep at all that night, my mind replaying the encounter over and over. The next day, I told a few of my coworkers about what I'd seen. Most of them laughed it off, suggesting I had just seen a bear or maybe a large dog. But a few older locals exchanged uneasy glances and mentioned stories of dogmen that had been whispered about for generations. They spoke of creatures that were half man, half wolf, stalking the forests at night. I never felt completely safe in that apartment again, and moved out the following year. I really have no way to explain this experience. Maybe werewolves are real. I have never been one to believe in the supernatural. Growing up in a small town in Wisconsin, I was always taught to look for logical explanations. However, an encounter I had in the summer of 2002 shattered my skepticism and left me questioning everything I thought I knew. It was a warm August evening, and I had been out hiking in the Nicolet National Forest. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows through the dense trees. I often hiked these trails alone, finding solace in the quiet beauty of the forest. As the light faded, I realized I had stayed out later than usual and quickened my pace to get back to my car before dark. The forest took on an eerie stillness as twilight descended, the usual sounds of wildlife falling silent. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the dimming light. But then I heard it, a rustling in the underbrush to my right, followed by a low, guttural growl. I stopped in my tracks, straining to see through the thick foliage. The growl came again, closer this time, and my heart began to race. I scanned the tree line, and that's when I saw it. Emerging from the shadows was a hulking figure, standing on two legs. It was covered in coarse, dark fur and had a face that was both man and beast, with piercing amber eyes that glowed in the twilight. I stood frozen, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. The creature's presence was overwhelming, exuding an aura of raw power and primal fear. It slowly moved towards me, its eyes locked onto mine. I could see the muscles rippling beneath its fur, the claws that glinted in the fading light. My first instinct was to run, but I knew I couldn't outrun something that moved with such predatory grace. Instead, I backed away slowly, trying to keep my movements calm and measured. The creature watched me intently, its growl vibrating through the air. As I backed away, my foot caught on a root, and I stumbled, falling to the ground. In that moment, I was sure it would pounce. But instead, the creature stopped and tilted its head, almost as if it was curious. We locked eyes again, and I felt a strange connection, a recognition of something ancient and powerful. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the creature turned and vanished back into the forest, its departure as silent as its approach. I scrambled to my feet and ran the rest of the way back to my car, not daring to look back. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys, and I didn't feel safe until I was back on the main road, the dense forest far behind me. When I got home, I was reluctant to tell anyone about what had happened. Who would believe me? But the memory of those eyes, that primal presence, haunted me. I still hike those trails, but I'm much more cautious now. I always make sure to be back well before dark, and I never go alone. The forest is still beautiful, but it holds a darker, more mysterious edge. I've come to accept that there are things out there we can't explain, creatures that defy our understanding. That encounter changed me. It shattered my skepticism and opened my mind to the unknown. I may never know what I saw that night, but I do know this. There are things in this world that are beyond our comprehension, lurking in the shadows, waiting to reveal themselves when we least expect it. Hey guys, just wanted to say thanks to everyone who listened and enjoyed today's episode. Be sure to subscribe for more storytelling soon.